Good afternoon, everybody, from wherever you may be joining us around the world. In South Africa, a very warm welcome from the University of Pretoria. We are very honoured to be hosting this webinar today. We are also very honoured to have an international expert on the topic joining us, who will be our guest speaker today, Professor John Dugard. He is well known to most people. He is an emeritus professor at the universities of the Witwatersrand as well as Leiden. He will be introduced properly shortly. But for now, I just want to welcome Professor Dugard and also thank him for agreeing to speak at our webinar today. We are in difficult times at the moment, and so we thought that this was a very appropriate time to have this webinar. And Professor Dugard will address us today on this topic, being an international law analysis of the conflict between Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Professor Dugard is in the Netherlands at the moment, in very cold temperatures. Here in South Africa, it is very hot. But thank you very much again, Professor Dugard, for agreeing to join us and also for being our guest speaker today. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Faranaz Varieva, who will introduce Professor Dugard. Over to you, Faranaz.
Thank you very much, Dean Skuman. It is an honor for me to introduce Professor Dugard today. Not only was I an international law student of Professor Dugard's at Wits University a few decades ago, but as a final year law student in 1994, doing voter education in prisons in anticipation of prisoners being given the right to vote in our first democratic election, the most common question asked by prisoners as I walked around the different prisons was if I could take a message from them to Professor Dugard. A few years later, I would work at the Center for Applied Legal Studies at Wits. Prof. Dugard was a founder and director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies from 1978, and he stayed in this position until 1990. Prof. Dugard remains one of the most principled and thoughtful human rights lawyers this country has produced. Professor Dugard is Emeritus Professor of Law at both Leiden University and Wits. He is an honorary professor of law here at UP at the Center for Human Rights. He has served as the director of the Lauterbach Center for International Law at Cambridge University from 1995 to 1997. From 1997 to 2011, he served as a member of the UN International Law Commission. He has also served as judge ad hoc of the International Court of Justice from 2000 to 2018. He is the author of countless scholarly publications, as well as the books International Law, A South African Perspective, and Confronting Apartheid, A Personal History of South Africa, Namibia, and Palestine. Relevant to today's discussion, after the outbreak of the Palestinian Second Intifada in the late 2000s, Professor Dugard was appointed by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights as the chairperson of the Commission of Inquiry into the Situation of Human Rights in the Palestinian Occupied Territories. In 2001, he was appointed as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on violations of human rights and humanitarian law in the Palestinian Occupied Territory. In the conclusion of a 2006 report as Special Rapporteur, Professor Dugard says, "It is pointless for the Special Rapporteur to recommend to the government of Israel that it show respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. More authoritative bodies, notably the International Court of Justice and the Security Council, have made similar appeals with as little success as have had previous reports of the Special Rapporteur. It also seems pointless for the special rapporteur to appeal to the quartet to strive for the restoration of human rights, as neither respect for human rights nor respect for the rule of law features prominently on the agenda of this group, as reflected in its public utterances. In these circumstances, the special rapporteur can only appeal to the wider international community, that is us, to concern ourselves more actively with the plight of the Palestinian people. On that note, Professor Dugard, I hand over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this webinar this afternoon. I'm very sorry that I'm not with you at the University of Pretoria. I have very fond memories of the University of Pretoria, and the weather, I'm sure, is much better there than it is here, and I miss you all. Today is really a very appropriate day to discuss the question of Palestine, because it was on this day in 1947 that the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the notorious partition resolution, Resolution 181, which partitioned the territory of Palestine, the mandated territory of Palestine, into the Jewish territory, which later became Israel, and the Palestinian territory. Today, this day is known as the International Day for Solidarity with Palestine, and so it is a very appropriate day on which to discuss this matter. I should mention that in terms of this Resolution 181, the General Assembly, which then consisted mainly of Western European states, decided by a narrow majority to give the Jewish community of Palestine 57% of the land, although the population, the Jewish population, comprised only 33% of the population of Palestine. This led to conflict between the Jewish and the Palestinian communities, and a number of other Arab states intervened, and so there was a conflict. And during the period of 1947-1948, 750,000 Palestinians were displaced and mainly forced into exile in neighboring territories, where they have continued to live as refugees ever since. This was known as the catastrophe or the Nakba, and this is really the beginning of the crisis that we face today. I might mention that after the Nakba, Israel, or the Jewish community, unilaterally declared the State of Israel. Over 78% of the territory of the former mandate of Palestine. Today I'm going to be speaking about the present conflict in Gaza and in the West Bank and even East Jerusalem, and of course in Israel itself. Before I do so, let me just say something about the population of Israel and of Palestine. The populations are more or less evenly matched. The population of Israel is some 9 million people, of whom 7 million are Jewish and 2 million are Palestinian. The population of the Palestinian territories of West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem number over 5 million. And so if you add the 2 million from Israel itself, you find that you have two communities of substantially the same size living in the territory between the sea and the river, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. today I'm going to be focusing largely on the conflict in Gaza, and I'm going to look at it from the perspective of three issues. First of all, the context. Secondly, the gravity. And thirdly, the institutional response. First of all, let me start with the context. I think we must accept that the events of 7th of October were atrocious. They constituted war crimes, possibly crimes against humanity, and they cannot be justified. So that is the starting point. But it's important to stress that the attack of Hamas on southern Israel should not be seen in isolation, in a vacuum. It should be seen in the context of what went before. Because for some 76 years, the Palestinian people have been subjected to what one can only describe as international injustice, starting with the Partition Resolution of 1947, the Nakba, and then the Six-Day War, which resulted in the occupation of the remaining 22% of the Palestinian territory. And since 1967, Israel has been the military occupier of the territory, and it has done this in an extraordinary manner. First of all, it has colonized the occupied territory, which is contrary to international law, clearly contrary to international law. So one has today a settler population of some 700 to 800,000 Jewish settlers living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Before 2005, there were Jewish settlements in Gaza itself, but they were withdrawn in 2005. So in the first instance, the territory has been colonized. Secondly, it has been subjected to a very oppressive and discriminatory regime. It is a brutal and harsh occupation to which the Palestinian people have been subjected. And it's become very clear that as a result of the colonization of Palestine, due to the transfer of Jewish settlers into the occupied Palestinian territory and the repressive regime, we have what is essentially a system of apartheid. I've made many visits to the region. I've seen it at first hand, and I lived under apartheid in South Africa. And I can say without hesitation, as many others have said, that the apartheid system in the occupied Palestinian territory is much harsher than the system of apartheid as it was applied in South Africa. So that is the context which one must bear in mind when one approaches this subject. I just wanted to say that on the subject of Hamas, that Hamas is not a terrorist organization as it has been identified by many Western states. It's a political organization with a political wing and a military wing. And of course, it's to be expected that there should be a military wing because the occupied Palestinian territory is, as the name suggests, occupied. So it's very similar to an occupied territory of the Second World War, such as the Netherlands or France, and there one had resistance movements, and so you must inevitably expect resistance movements such as Hamas in the in Gaza and indeed in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. When I was UN Special Rapporteur from 2001 to 2008, and I visited Palestine frequently, I suggested to the United Nations that it should speak to Hamas, that there was no reason why it should not speak to Hamas in the same way that the United Nations and its agencies had communicated with the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress during the apartheid years. But these suggestions fell on deaf ears, and to a large extent, Hamas has been isolated by the international community and not allowed to participate in the Western powers in particular. So that's the context. Secondly, address the subject of the gravity of the conflict. I will on the 6th of October assault here and I feel inside
Sorry, I think we've lost Professor Dugard for a bit. We'll just wait for him to reconnect if everybody can just be a little bit patient. Thank you very much. I don't have his phone number. You're back, Professor Dugard. You're muted, Professor Dugard. Still muted. There you go.
Is that all right?
Right.
I'm
Yes.
terribly sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I can only conclude that the Mossad is listening into our discussions.
Yeah, people sent me similar messages as a joke. Can we ask you to start from the Hamas point, please?
Yes, I think I've just finished speaking about Hamas, and I was turning to my next point, which is the gravity of the situation. And I did say that the attack on the 7th of October was a serious violation of human rights, atrocious, but the response of Israel has been completely disproportionate. We've seen some 15,000 persons killed, many more wounded, millions displaced, and property damaged on a large scale. And what is particularly tragic is that some 5,000 children have been killed, and many women. And more than half the number of people killed have been women and children. And this attack has violated many norms of international law. First of all, it constitutes a war crime. The laws of war, international humanitarian law, are to be found in international customary law, the Geneva Convention from 1949, the Rome Statute, and optional protocols to the Geneva Convention. And they make it very clear that the indiscriminate and disproportionate killing of civilians and the targeting of civilians constitutes a war crime. So that's the first crime that has been committed. Secondly, the conduct of Israel in Gaza must be categorized as a crime against humanity. A crime against humanity occurs when you have a systematic and widespread attack on a civilian population, which involves a number of acts. First of all, murder. And in this case, there's no doubt that many of the assaults of the Israeli Defense Forces on Gaza constitute the crime of murder, because there is intentional killing of thousands of Palestinians. The intention may be inferred from the fact that Israel has acted completely recklessly without regard to human life. So that's the first act that constitutes the crime against humanity. Secondly, it is a crime against humanity to forcibly transfer population. And this means that the order to evacuate from North Gaza to the south of Gaza must be seen as a crime against humanity. And of course, when one thinks of war crimes, there's also the bombing of hospitals and mosques and schools, which is also categorized as a war crime under international humanitarian law. And this brings me to the crime of genocide, which has now been used for the first time to describe the assault on Gaza. The crime of genocide is committed when individuals intentionally and deliberately inflict conditions on a national or racial group calculated to destroy them in whole or in part. And I think there's no doubt that the attack on Gaza has resulted in the destruction of the Palestinian population of Gaza. And so it can legitimately be described as genocide. Let me just tell you anecdotally, when in 2009, I was in charge of a commission of inquiry, a fact-finding mission into Operation Cast Lead, which was the first assault by Israel on Gaza. In that assault, only 1,400 Palestinians were killed. But at the end of our investigation, the fact-finding mission, after a week of speaking to victims and viewing the situation, I asked my team what crime had been committed, and unanimously they said genocide, which presented serious problems because at that stage, the very notion that Israel was guilty of the crime of genocide was totally unacceptable. And so we decided instead to categorize it as collective punishment. But it's very clear that Israel's present actions constitute the crime of genocide. It's clear from the statements made by Israeli politicians and leading figures that the intention is to either destroy in part the population of Gaza, or also to compel the population of Gaza to move out into the Sinai desert. In other words, to leave Gaza permanently. So the crimes that have been committed are serious crimes, and they violate many norms of international law. The third point that I wish to raise is that of the institutional failure. Institutions whose task it is to maintain international peace and security, to respect human rights, and to secure accountability of those responsible for violating international humanitarian law and international human rights law, have failed dismally. Here one thinks particularly of the Security Council, where the United States has vetoed resolutions condemning the assault and calling for a ceasefire. One thinks of the European Union. Western European states, with few exceptions, have supported Israel and made no attempt to bring the proceedings the attack to an end. And of course, one must include the United Kingdom, no longer a member of the European Union, but it has also adopted a strong pro-Israel approach. And then another institution which has behaved very irresponsibly is the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over the territory of Palestine. It held that in 2021, and the present prosecutor, Karim Khan, is said to be examining the issue of the situation in Palestine with a view to prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity, and it has done nothing. Instead, it has focused all its attention and spent all its funding on the war in Ukraine, which has the backing of the Western powers that fund the International Criminal Court. And so one can say that the Security Council of the United Nations, the European Union, Western states, and the International Criminal Court have all behaved dismally in promoting their own goals. What is interesting is that these Western states have completely failed to apply international law. On the one hand, it may be argued that they see Israel as a state above the law. Another explanation may be that one finds that the United States in particular no longer speaks about being bound by international law. Instead, it argues that it is bound by the rules-based international order. No one quite knows what the rules-based international order is, but this is an order to which President Biden refers repeatedly, as does his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. And in effect, the rules-based international order is the Western interpretation of international law, which is an interpretation which serves the best interests of the Western European states. And so one finds that many Western European states have categorized Israel's assault on Gaza as self-defense, whereas it's not self-defense, it's simply enforcement of the occupation. And similarly, they tend to minimize the assaults on Gaza by claiming that this is simply collateral damage that is inflicted when Israel attacks Hamas in the territory of Gaza. And so there are many other examples too of instances in which the Western European states have interpreted international law in order to serve their own interests, but not in accordance with traditional international law. So the conclusion that one must reach on this subject is that international institutions and Western states in particular have failed the international community and have failed Palestine in particular. The final point that I want to mention concerns the future. What happens after the Gaza conflict? Who will control the territory of Gaza and what will its future be? Well, I think it's very clear that Gaza should not be reoccupied by Israel, nor should it be occupied or administered by the United States, which is simply an agent of Israel. In the short term, it might be properly administered by the United Nations or by Arab states, or indeed by the Palestinian Authority that controls the West Bank at present. The future of Gaza is completely uncertain. The final point I wish to make is that in February of next year, the International Court of Justice will give an advisory opinion on the question of whether the occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories is illegal. Essentially, the argument is that the occupation has now gone on for over 50 years. It is prolonged. It has violated important principles of international law. It has seen the de jure annexation of East Jerusalem, the de facto annexation of much of the West Bank. it has seen the denial of the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people, and it has imposed a discriminatory and repressive regime upon the Palestinian people, amounting to the policy of apartheid. So it is argued that for these reasons, the International Court of Justice should declare the occupation to be unlawful. If this does happen, it will be an advisory opinion only, but it will undoubtedly have implications for the future and will indicate that Israel must desist from further occupation of the territory and must dismantle settlements. Of course, this raises the whole question of whether there should be a two-state solution or a single-state solution, which is a major topic which I cannot go into today. So let me conclude by saying that one has to see the present conflict in its context, that very serious international crimes have been committed and that the international community generally has failed Palestine. Let me end there and subject myself to questioning, bearing in mind that intense questioning constitutes a form of torture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dugard. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I think it's very important that it was contextualized all the way back to 1947. We are now going to hand over to Professor Zozo Diani Mahango, who is the head of the Department of Public Law here at the University of Pretoria. She also has a specialization in international law. When we asked her to be the respondent, her answer was, yes, but I don't think I will disagree with anything that Professor Dugard says. So on that note, I think maybe she can just elaborate on what Professor Dugard says and maybe even tell us whether she thinks it should be a one-state solution or two-state solution, although that's very unfair to put her on the spot like that. Over to you, Zozo.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paradise. You just put me on the spot. I see my video is not showing. I don't know what's happening. I'm gonna keep on talking until I figure it out. But good afternoon, colleagues. It's really an honor to be the respondent to this lecture. And as I've said to Faranaz, I also feel intimidated knowing that I'll be responding to Professor Dugard, who's well known when it comes to international law in South Africa and elsewhere. So I would like to first thank you, Professor Dugard, for agreeing to doing this. We know you are very busy, but we would like to thank you for the lecture. It is very timely, and at the same time, I think that it is very late. We should have thought of it way before the 29th of November, 2023. This was a very good lecture. I don't have to say that. I don't have to say that it's an excellent lecture, but this was a very good lecture. I hope that my students are listening, are watching the lecture as well. Mine is not to respond to all the points that were made, and of course I agree to all of them. The issue of self-defense, whether this was self-defense, the issue of whether Hamas is a terrorist group, and the fact that international institutions have failed Palestine. I agree with all of those. And I think that we all agree that the Gaza-Israel conflict is and should be the concern for the international community at large, and specifically to all international law academics. It has been quite disappointing to see that some of the academic debates have not been about the principles of international law that are relevant to this conflict, but have been about what South Africans call the whataboutism. Like, what about the fact that Hamas started this? What about the fact that this, and that should not be the point. Some have even forgotten about the fact that the principles of international humanitarian law, in particular, the principle of humanity, which encompasses all, that even in the midst of an armed conflict, the humanity should be prioritized. So we saw and heard reports of others being called subhumans, animals, so that the principle of humanity should be ignored. I mean, if you call someone a subhuman, then that means that you cannot really apply the principle of humanity when it comes to the conflict in Gaza, Israel, or Gaza, Palestine, Israel conflict. We have also seen the principle of distinction being optional, where hospitals and residential areas are being bombed without regard for those who are not taking part in the hostilities. Like Professor Jugati has mentioned, the fact that children, women have been killed. We have seen the videos of children dying in the arms of their parents, or being on the floor, having died because of this conflict. I mean, for hospitals and residential areas to being bombed with disregard, it really is a concern, and it makes us as international law academics to feel like we are not doing the job. For example, I felt like such a hypocrite when I saw these pictures and videos of bodies of women and children who were killed in that conflict, and yet I'm teaching students about the principles of international humanitarian law, and yet we are seeing all these things. And also the fact that the Security Council, once again, is inactive because of the veto powers, is a problem. And it makes me think about all these debates that have been happening, I think, for over decades, about the reform of the Security Council, that we cannot really rely on what the UN Charter said in 1945, because things have changed. We no longer have those few states. Now we have about 193 states, and we only have 5 group of states that are controlling the narrative when it comes to these issues. So I agree totally with Professor Jugat when he says that the international institutions have failed Palestine, and they all have also failed international law. And we really need to think through the future of international law. I mean, we agree that what is happening in Gaza amounts to international crimes, war crimes in particular, and also crimes against humanity. But what made me think when Professor Jugat was speaking was about what type of conflict are we talking about here? Because if we remember the construction of wall advisory opinion, we have seen that the ICJ has said that the construction of the wall by Israel in Palestine was not a state against a state event. It was, we're talking about one state, we're not talking about two states. So taking into account also the Bush doctrine on self-defense against terrorism. So what type of conflict are we talking about? And what also made me think is, while we're talking about the Geneva Conventions being applicable in the situation in Gaza-Israel conflict, but what really is happening there? Is it a non-international armed conflict? Is it an international conflict, armed conflict? What is the relevance of the United States in that war, putting it in inverted commas? So I think, Farnaz, I'm not going to take those 10 minutes because, as I've said, I agree totally with what Professor Jugat has said. And I also agree that the attack by Hamas cannot be seen in isolation with what has been happening over 75 years ago, the way in which Palestinian community has been treated in that region, and also the issues of the fact that this is a colonized territory. And we always tell our students of international law that with the coming into force of the UN Charter, colonization then slowly disappeared, and also with with South Africa being independent, then we got rid of colonization, but we are seeing it now happening. So yeah, I would like to also find out, what should the international community do, and what reforms should the international community come up with, seeing that the Security Council is not working? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zozo. That's much appreciated. And yes, while you did agree with Professor Dugard, I think you also elaborated quite a bit on the human aspect, which is what we have been seeing every day and seeing the horror of it. And it just conjures up, especially as mothers and as women, the gravity of what is going on. So yeah, I think you nicely brought a picture to all of that. And I think Zozo had a question there. I'm going to hand over now to Professor Joel Mudiri, who is the head of our jurisprudence department here at the University of Pretoria. We decided to ask Joel to moderate because whatever Joel does, he brings a huge presence to it. And we wanted to ensure that he protects Professor Dugard from any disrespectful questions. But Professor Dugard assures me that he can handle himself when it comes to disrespectful questions. Joel, I see there's quite a few questions on the chat already. And maybe you can start from there and I'll leave it up to you.
Thank you very much, Farnaz, and good evening to everyone and Professor Dugard. It's been an interesting set of discussions from an international law perspective. Of course, as everyone knows, there are several other perspectives of a much more wide-ranging political, economic, historical perspectives shaping this conflict. But let's jump straight into the question and answers for Professor Dugard, noting his warning that some of the questions may constitute torture, which I'm going to ask everyone to avoid. We are members of a university community and we are engaged in academic discourse and dialogue. So I will ask that those who we will soon be inviting for questions exercise the necessary restraint, both in terms of the length of their questions, to be pointed, clear and succinct, but also to avoid anything more than just really an attempt to open up engagement, whether by means of agreement or disagreement or clarification, or opening other avenues. We don't expect to resolve the multifaceted nature of this issue in the next 30 minutes, but we certainly hope for further enriching engagement and dialogue with Professor Dugard, who's been generous enough to share his time. So I've picked up a few questions in question and answer. That is questions that have been submitted in writing. I'm going to ask all the participants to rather ask their questions in person, and we will essentially operate in rounds of 3. So I'm going to ask Kenneth Creamer, Lerato Tsebe, and Sumaya Mohammed Ali to each ask their questions. So I'm not going to read out any written questions. We're going to ask people to ask their questions in person, and then we'll take it from there. So if I can ask Kenneth Creamer, who had the first question. Kenneth, go ahead.
Yes, hi, thank you very much, Joel, and thank you to the university for this opportunity. Professor Dugard was also my teacher many years ago, and it's wonderful to see him again. I just wonder, Professor Dugard, if you could reflect on any comparison between the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the ongoing conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. Just bringing into your thoughts on the international law breaches and comparing the international law breaches in those two conflicts and possibly the war crimes that have taken place in those two conflicts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. We'll jump straight to Lerato Tsebe. Lerato, are you still with us?
Yes, hi. Afternoon, colleagues. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Yes. Hi, Prof. Dugard. Thanks so much for such an informative lecture. That was really, really amazing. I just wanted to ask you, as someone who has been a UN Special Rapporteur and also you're an international law expert, institutionally, this has been a catastrophe for the authority and institutional integrity of the United Nations as a whole. So I just wanted to ask you, from your perspective, Prof, where to from here for the UN? And given all it seems as though these are compounded crises that the UN is confronted by, whether it's Ukraine, Sudan, DRC, is it not perhaps time, Prof, to start looking at perhaps we need to rewrite or consider rewriting the UN Charter, as I'm not so convinced that the blame can solely be put on the UN Security Council as a whole anymore. I don't think that's sufficient anymore.
Thank you very much, Lerato. Sumaya?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, good afternoon. Really enjoying this engaging lecture. I just wanted to find out, just hang on one second.
Sumaya, we're getting some feedback from your end. I don't know if you need to just manage the sound from your end. You can try again, but it seems like you've connected from 2 devices.
Is it better? Is it a little bit better now?
Slightly better. Go ahead.
Okay. Is it clear?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to find out with regards to Hamas and, since October 7th, everybody is like, we condemn Hamas. Yes, their actions were atrocious, but there has been reports about this Hannibal doctrine where IOF have been, were actually commanded to shell basically indiscriminately. And they've been reported the actual civilian casualties have been more from the IOF shelling than anything else. And that Hamas's intention was to take hostages for the purposes of negotiating their own prisoners. Wouldn't that change the narrative? And secondly, are the UN actually investigating these reports? That was my question.
Thank you very much. Just to mention that I've noted the questions from Alicia, Musawenkosi, and Sean. You'll come in the next round. Professor Dugard, over to you.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Yes. First question, Kenneth has asked about the comparisons between the conflict in Gaza and the conflict in Ukraine. Well, they are very different, but they must both be seen in the context of international law. In the case of the conflict in Ukraine, the Federation of Russia has attacked another state, and obviously that is a violation of international law. It violates the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Whereas in the case of Gaza, Palestine, we are dealing with a situation essentially of military occupation. Palestine is an occupied territory and has been since 1967, and Israel is the occupying power. So there are very different situations, but they do have some similarities in the sense that Russia has occupied parts of the Ukraine, and so the question of the Fourth Geneva Convention dealing with occupation does apply in respect of Ukraine as well. But I do think that one should see them as very different conflicts. Let me say that I think one of the distinguishing features is the manner in which the Western world has responded to the assault on Ukraine and the way in which it has responded to the actions of Israel. In the case of Ukraine, the international community, by and large, has raised international law arguments in order to condemn Israel for its actions, has accused Israel of violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine and of violating principles of humanitarian law. But when it comes to the situation in Gaza, the Western world does not speak the language of international law, and that is what really troubles me. If one reads the newspapers that support or in Western countries, one finds very little reference to international law. I think the problem is that the Western world does not wish to hold Israel accountable for its actions, and so it fails to see the conflict in the context of international law. And I think that's an important distinction. The second question is a big question, and it relates to the UN system. There's no doubt that the war in Ukraine and now the conflict in Gaza, Israel, has tested the powers of the United Nations. And we've seen, particularly in the Gaza conflict, that the United Nations is really unable to act because of the veto cast by the United States. And I think this does make it very clear that the Security Council can no longer play a role in the maintenance of international peace and security. In the case of Ukraine, we have the Russian veto, and in the case of Gaza, we have the American veto, and it's become very clear that the Security Council is no longer a body that can maintain international peace and security, which means that the General Assembly will have to take action insofar as it can and is able to do so on its own without resort to the Security Council. But this does challenge the whole UN system. I wasn't quite clear about the third question. It essentially related to Hamas and to the intentions of Hamas. I think this is a case in which there's a lot of disinformation. We don't quite know exactly what happened on the 7th of October, what the intentions of Hamas were, and what, to some extent, what their actions were. We know that a large number of Israelis were brutally killed, but there is evidence that many of those killed were killed in the course of conflict between the Israelis, the IDF, and Hamas, and that many civilians were killed in that crossfire. So I think it's very difficult to say at this stage without a proper investigation as to what the intentions of Hamas were in embarking upon this exercise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dugard. We'll take another round of questions. The first one is from Alicia Samuels, the next one from Musa Wenkosi, and then the next one from Sean. Please go ahead, keeping in mind my request for brevity and clarity.
Sure. Thank you, Professor Dugard and Professor Suzuko, as the respondent. As an academic, the silence from the academic community, academic journals at the forefront of children's health, human rights, as well as global health, has also been a major disappointment. There seems to be so much fear to speak out against Israel because of the weaponizing of the term anti-Semitic. What do you feel should be the role of academics at this moment in time?
Thank you. Musa Wenkosi, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much. I would like to appreciate this opportunity to be involved in this webinar. Thank you, Dr. Dugard. I just want to find out, because some of us are just studying these things, and we are here in South Africa, and we have never moved much around the world. So I just want to find out. I've seen on television that there is Gaza on one side, and then there's Israel, and then there's West Bank or something like that on the other side. I just want to find out what kind of a territory is Gaza? Is it on the side next to the sea, and then there's Israel in between Gaza and West Bank? And then maybe the second part of the question is what makes Palestine as a territory? I'd like to find that one out. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Sean, you can go ahead.
Thanks very much indeed. And thank you, Professor Dugard, for your usual clarity and effective presentation. I don't think there's any doubt that the world is fractured in a very uncomfortable way at present. One way of looking at it is perhaps, and both of these are archetypes, neither is precise, between the West in its traditional sense and a global South that is in the process of emerging and being defined. And what has happened in respect of the ghastly events in Gaza over the course of the past month and 3 weeks have heightened that and sharpened it to an extraordinarily uncomfortable degree. The challenge is how we put it together again. There's no question that what is being done constitutes, in the broad sense of the term, a crime against humanity. The difficulty is that if we cannot use public international law and international humanitarian law in particular to craft collective understanding on which there can be agreement of what constitutes the rule of law, then this type of contrary discourse will simply continue to frustrate any proper institutional response. If one takes, I found the most interesting part from a legal perspective of what you said, John, was the reference to genocide. And, you know, if one takes Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide as the only reference point that I know that is useful in this regard, then it might be helpful to try and use that as a frame in order to be able to determine to what extent what is being done violates that, and therefore to try and bring clarity using international humanitarian law rather than political discourse. I'd very much like your response.
Thank you very much. We have received 3 questions. One of them involve you as well, Professor Jani Mhango, pertaining to the silence of academics, especially in the human rights space. What should be the role of academics at this moment? So I'll ask you, Professor Jani Mhango, to quickly jump in with.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mudiri. As I've said earlier, that it has been disappointing to see the academic debates, not necessarily from South Africa, but I've seen some blogs discussing this conflict, whether which side is right, so to speak. But the role of academics, obviously, especially for international law academics, is to really talk about these. I've seen there are blogs internationally, but I haven't really seen anything, and I'm also to blame because I'm also an international law scholar. We haven't really done anything in South Africa about it, but I think, and I also believe that we should discuss these issues, especially for us who come from South Africa, and also knowing how South Africa is has positioned herself when it comes to the Israeli-Palestine situation. So we haven't done much. We are to blame. Maybe it's because it was exam time, etc. But we need to do more, and hopefully we'll be doing something after this webinar. Thanks.
Joe, do you want me to respond?
You're on mute, Professor Mudiri.
Can you hear me now? Joel, I can't hear you.
I think you can go ahead, Professor Jugard. Something is happening there.
Yes. First of all, let me just say in response to the first question, which has been answered, that the accusation of anti-Semitism is designed to silence critics of Israel, and it's a very serious tool to silence criticism. And all I can say is that one must resist this silencing tool and make it very clear that one is engaged in criticism of the state of Israel and not the Jews that comprise the state of Israel. So I think there's a sharp distinction between criticism of the government of Israel and the Jewish people, and that distinction must be maintained. Second question related to the geography of the territory of Palestine. Briefly, let me say that Palestine is a territory. On the one hand, there's the Mediterranean Sea. On the other hand, there's the Jordan River. That the state of Palestine comprises the West Bank of the Jordan River, the eastern section of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. The East Jerusalem and West Bank are linked, whereas there is no direct connection between Gaza and these other two territories because the state of Israel falls in between. And so it's really a very difficult state to, Palestine is a difficult state to manage because of the separation of Gaza from the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So the third question is the big question that Sean has raised, and that is the impact that the present conflict has had upon international institutions and on the world in general. And I think one has to have regard to the conflict in Ukraine in this context as well, because we have seen that the Security Council is completely incapable of acting when one of the major powers is involved in a conflict. And there have been suggestions of reform to the UN system for many years, particularly reform to the Security Council, and I think it becomes more necessary than ever to attempt more seriously to change the system, particularly in order to give a greater voice to the global south, because there's no doubt that the present system, which confers a veto power essentially on the major states of World War II, without regard to other major powers in the world today, is defective. And one really has to re-examine the whole composition and constitution of the United Nations. And also, as I've indicated, international law itself is discredited by the failure of the Western states to condemn Israel's actions. And I'm very troubled by the fact that one finds the United States in particular, and to a lesser extent Western states, talking about the rules-based international order instead of international law. And it's their own interpretation of international law which seems to prevail. I think one needs to return to the traditional principles of international law. I don't think there's anything wrong with international law itself. It's the interpretation placed upon international law in recent times that troubles me. This is a big question, and let me leave it there, but suffice it to say that both the United Nations and international law are challenged by the present conflict.
Joel, I think Musad is out for you again. Do you want me to take 3 questions, Joel? Give me a thumbs up or not. Okay. Have we taken Brent Harker? Can we ask Brent Harker to ask his question, please? What is the international law status of the original agreement to create the State of Israel? Is that a recognized international agreement in 1948 to create one state? Is that agreement recognized under international law? And then after that, so I think Professor Dugard would have taken that down. Thank you very much. And then Kanya Motshabi, if she can ask her question.
Can you hear me now, Farnaz?
Yeah, Joel, you're back. You're back.
Good, good. Yeah, so the questions will take, as you said, first we'll take Brent, we'll take Kanya Mochabi, who's a colleague of ours, and Tana Mokoka, and then we're going to close the questions. So, Brent, you can restate the question again, and then Kanya, and then Tana Mokoka. Brent, go ahead. Okay. Yes, Professor Dugard, Brent's question is about the international law status of the original agreement to create the state of Israel. So that's question number one. Dade Mutabi, where are you? Okay, I think we've also lost Kanya. Tana Makoka, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, go ahead.
Okay. So I liked what Prof. Dugard was saying about looking at the legality of the occupation. But what I would like to know is whether the words illegal occupation is just coloniality by another name. The West's acceptance of the acquisition of property through force is deserving of urgent attention. Is the international law jurisprudence that links crimes against humanity to UN declarations or resolutions on decolonization? Because coloniality as a system of various actions, for me, is deserving of being elevated to the category of crimes against humanity. So, yeah, if we could maybe just look at the question of Palestine through a decoloniality lens. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Tana. I'll take the last two questions, Shue and Ibrahim. Professor Dugard to some extent answered Ibrahim's questions, but it's worth closing on that question. So very briefly, Shue and Ibrahim, go ahead. Let's start with you, Shue. Shue, are you here? So, Professor Dugard, Shue's question relates to whether the South African government has been doing enough to take a stance on the conflict. That's the question from Shue. And the final question, Ibrahim Fakir. Ibrahim, go ahead. Ibrahim, are you with us? Okay, let's close with those few questions. Professor Dugard, did you get the questions? You are muted, Professor Dugard. Still muted, Prof. Muted again. It seems you're double clicking. Yeah, now we have you.
Yes, could you ask Tana to repeat her question? I didn't catch Tana's question.
Okay, I'll ask it again, Prof. Dugard. I was saying that I like what you were saying about looking at the legality of Israel's occupation. But what I would like to know is whether the words illegal occupation is just coloniality by another name. The West's acceptance of the acquisition of property through force is deserving of urgent attention. Is there international law jurisprudence that links decolonization, UN declarations or resolutions on decolonization to crimes against humanity as a category? So if we could maybe just look at the situation in Palestine through a decoloniality lens. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Well, let me answer the first question posed by Brent, and that is the creation of the State of Israel. So this was extremely controversial. The other mandated territories in the Middle East were granted independence in accordance with the boundaries laid down by the League of Nations. But when it came to the state of Palestine, which was a mandated territory under a British mandate, there was a conflict between the Jewish community and the Arab community. The Arab community wanted the mandated territory of Palestine to become an independent state, as it had within the territory of the mandated territory of Palestine. But this was obviously not acceptable to the Jewish community, and so it was put to the General Assembly of the United Nations, and the United Nations resolved that the territory should be partitioned. And reluctantly, the Jewish agency accepted the partition. The Arab community did not accept it. There was a conflict, and in the course of that conflict, Israel declared its independence unilaterally. So it was not created by the United Nations. It was really created by facts on the ground resulting from the conflict of 1947, 1948. And then the State of Israel was recognized, because recognition is the way that international law provides for the creation of a new state. And so Israel was recognized as an independent state. It was immediately recognized by both the United States and the Soviet Union. And so Israel became a state. Most Arab states at that stage refused to recognize Israel. Today, many Arab states do, such as Jordan and Egypt and others. So there is no international agreement on the creation of the State of Israel. Israel has come into existence as a result of recognition by other states, and of course by reason of admission to the United Nations. It was admitted to the United Nations in 1949. The second question is that of Tanya, and it relates, if I understand, essentially to the subject of the illegality of the occupation. One school of thought holds that an occupation is a state of fact, and that it cannot become an illegal occupation. But now the argument is raised that occupation is generally meant to be temporary and to continue only so far as no peace agreement is reached. Most occupations last for a few number of years. But in this case, the occupation has gone on for over 50 years. And so the argument goes that it is prolonged, it's gone beyond the time limit of a normal occupation. And in addition, Israel has violated many basic principles of international law in the course of its occupation. It has annexed East Jerusalem de jure. In fact, it has occupied and annexed many parts of the West Bank by establishing settlements in the territory, and denied self-determination and applied discriminatory practices. So the argument is that the sum total of these violations results in the illegality of the occupation. But that is a matter that the International Court of Justice will be asked to decide in February of next year. Finally, there's a question of Abraham, which is the question, has South Africa done enough? And the answer to that question is that South Africa has probably done more than any other state to support Palestine. South Africa has made submissions to the International Court of Justice on the illegality of occupation. It has compared the situation in Palestine with that of apartheid South Africa. It has, in recent times, referred the crime of genocide committed in Palestine to the International Criminal Court. This is a major step. In 2018, the state of Palestine referred the situation in Palestine to the International Criminal Court in respect of the of war crimes and crimes against humanity. But now South Africa and 4 other states have gone one step further and referred the crime of genocide in Palestine to the International Criminal Court. And of course, South Africa has also recalled its ambassador and diplomatic staff from Israel. So South Africa has probably done more than any other state in the international community to indicate its disapproval of Israel's conduct in respect of Palestine. And of course, this hasn't won South Africa many friends. Many Western states are seriously aggrieved by the fact that South Africa has taken such a firm stand against Palestine. And one simply hopes that South Africa will not have to pay a price for this support for Palestine. But I think the South African government is motivated by the words of Nelson Mandela that South Africa will not be really free until Palestine is free. So Mandela did see the situation in Palestine as very similar to that of apartheid South Africa, and that's clearly the way in which the South African government sees the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dugard. If you were here in person, we'd extend a warm round of applause, and I'm sure there'd certainly also be some dinner in store for you. I'm going to thank everyone who's participated and hand over to the Dean of the Faculty of Law, Professor Elsabe Skuman, to assist us with a vote of thanks and the closure of today's event. I'm sure there are many more questions. And thankfully, as members of the university communities, we know where to look for information, and that's in the library. So, Professor Skuman, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel, for managing the question and answer session. As we know, Professor Dugard needs no protection, but nevertheless, it was wonderful to have a moderator for that session. Thank you very much. We are almost, we are running out of time, so I will be brief. First of all, again, Professor Dugard, thank you so much for agreeing to address us today. The clarity of your presentation, the insights you shared with us, those were absolutely wonderful. And I think for many people on this call, including myself, it was really worth listening to you and also to hear your views and your opinions, and also grounded, of course, in international law. So thank you very much again. Thank you also for engaging with all the questions, taking them down, and also being patient while we struggled a little bit to get you back online. So thank you very much from all of us. And now there would normally be a round of applause, so please imagine of applause for you. And I would also like to thank Dr. Paranas Berieva for organizing the webinar. Thank you very much for taking the lead on this. It is very much appreciated by the faculty. I would like to thank Professor Gianni Mango for responding for agreeing with Professor Dugard, but also raising a few other issues. Thank you very much. We also enjoyed hearing your insights, and thank you for responding in such a constructive manner. Thank you very much. And then finally, from the University of Pretoria, from the Faculty of Law, we would like to thank everybody who attended this afternoon. We are really heartened to see the number of people joining us online. So thank you very much to everyone. And then also thank you to Simpiwe from the Centre of Human Rights for arranging the platform for us. Colleagues, we are going to say goodbye now from Pretoria. I think this was a very valuable contribution to the discourse at the moment on this particular matter, and I hope that you will all continue to think about this, to discuss this, and also to seek information. Thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening, wherever you may be. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Dugard, and thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again, Prof. Dugard.
Thank you, Prof. Dugard. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dugard.
Thanks, Varnas.
Thank you.
Thank you for being so supportive, Dean.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, professors. Enjoy your evening.